Hello and welcome to week 2 of Progress. Tonight we will have several sessions with such topics as diversity and inclusion, recruitment, alumni relations, and more. To see what sessions are up next, you can always refer to the schedule. If you find yourself with some time in between sessions, we encourage you to stop by the hangar to ask questions or participate in one of the new video chats we added this week. Without further ado, to welcome our guest speaker tonight, I'd like to bring to the stage National Counselor Ricky Bailey.
Greetings, brothers. I am Ricky Bailey, National Counselor and 2003 initiate of the Beta Iota chapter at Florida State University. I have the honor of introducing the guest speaker for this session, entitled Building Inclusive Leaders, the Journey of Unlearning and Relearning. But before I do, I'd like to take a moment to share what Phi Kappa Tau is doing related to this topic. Phi Kappa Tau recently launched a diversity, equity, and inclusion task force to examine and strengthen our ability to provide an inclusive environment for all of our members, past, present, and future, regardless of race, religion, sexual orientation, identity, or any other personal preferences. We understand the innate worth of the individual is not determined by these factors, but rather by one's character. As a member of this task force, I am proud of the work we are doing to examine our history, recognizing what we are doing right, and taking action on the continued work that must be done to improve the fraternity experience for all of our members. Stay tuned to upcoming communication, which will share details of what's been accomplished, the work we continue to do, and how you can get involved. With that, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker for the session, Dr. David E. Jones. Dr. David E. Jones is the Chief Diversity Officer and Director of Talent Management at William Patterson University in Wayne, New Jersey, where he leads an institutional diversity agenda to create an inclusive campus community for faculty, students, and staff. Regularly invited by organizations to serve as a diversity consultant, strategist, speaker, and trainer, Dr. Jones has served on the teaching faculty for the Equity Institute at the University of Southern California Race and Equity Center since 2018. David holds a Doctorate of Education in Organizational Leadership and Communication from Northeastern University, a Master of Education in College Student Affairs from the University of South Florida, and a Bachelor of Science in Communications from Eastern Connecticut State University. Prior to his position with William Patterson, his career includes serving in higher education leadership roles at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, City University of New York, University of Massachusetts Lowell, New York University, and University of South Florida. Brothers, please welcome Dr. David E. Jones.
Greetings, and welcome to my session, Building Inclusive Leaders, the Journey of Unlearning and Relearning. To begin this session, I would like to frame our conversation with a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. When Dr. King said injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, he was talking about his commitment and our collective commitment to responding to all forms of oppression and injustice in our country, whether it was economic rights, voting rights, civil rights, racial justice, rights for women, rights for trans folks, rights for the LGBTQ community, rights for immigrants, indigenous peoples, and so on and so on. Dr. King remains a legacy of hope in terms of what we can do to respond to the injustices that we see in our society today. So I encourage you to think about what your social responsibility will be to respond to injustice, to be sure that you are not just responding to one form of injustice, but all forms of injustice. And we will talk about that in a little bit in terms of what that looks like in being an ally to different communities. In recent months, racial injustice, though, has really plagued our society and has taken center attention in terms of the different forms of injustice that we can be fighting for. With continued police brutality and the lifeless individuals that have been taken from us as a result of racial violence in America, we must take a stance, right? We must take a social responsibility to have a stance against racial injustice and ways in which we can fight it to create a more equitable society. Folks like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, Ahmaud Arbery, Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, Eric Gardner, and so many others should be with us today. Their lives mattered, and their human dignity should be given some worth in our society. Because their skin is seen as a threat, because their skin is seen as a weapon, they are no longer here because it made someone feel uncomfortable, so much so uncomfortable that they took the individual's life. And so we need to do our part to speak up for injustice, particularly racial injustice, to dismantle the inequities that show up against Black and brown people in our society. And that's what inclusive leadership looks like. When we take the responsibility to form our opinion, and an opinion in a way that is inclusive and demonstrates our commitment to social justice. And so I'm asking you, did you speak out in the murders of any of those individuals on the previous slide? Did you speak out for George Floyd when we saw the heightened level of awareness and increased protests across the globe, right? Did you speak out? Did you speak out for LGBTQ rights? Did you speak out for immigrant rights? Did you speak out for folks that are identify as disabled? Did you speak out for women? Did you speak out for other categories, social identities that we need to be able to claim as important to our overall portfolio of advancing equity and inclusion in our organizations? And if you didn't speak out, that's fine. But now's the time. Now's the time to speak out, because silence cannot be something that we are okay with. We cannot be submissive in the moments of silence, right? Because silence allows us to appear as if everything is okay. And sometimes we're silent because we don't know what to do, and that is fine too. But now is the time to seek out ways in which you can do something, right? It is time to speak out and be that inclusive leader that our organizations and our society so desperately needs. So I'm asking you to speak out. I'm asking you to give of yourself, right? To utilize your social identities that may exert some form of privilege and speak out for those that do not have it. That's because inclusive leaders are the following, and I encourage you to adapt each and every one of these perspectives. Inclusive leaders are open to new and different forms of perspectives. Inclusive leaders are authentic and honest. Inclusive leaders are willing to share. Inclusive leaders are patient with others. Inclusive leaders are respectful. They are also present and engaged. Inclusive leaders are able to lean into the discomfort. Inclusive leaders are mindful of what it takes to create safe, but also brave spaces. Inclusive leaders are committed to using learning moments to create change and make a better tomorrow. And most importantly, inclusive leaders are brave enough to start a conversation that matters. And so will you embody these principles, these values, to be that inclusive leader for your fraternity? Will you embody these principles and values to increase our society that is more just and more equitable for everyone? It is up to you to make this happen. And hopefully this session will spark some inspiration, some motivation, and a willingness to do more as an inclusive leader. But first, it starts with understanding who you are. So who are you? Is the question you want to ask yourself. Are you able to find your true identity? Are you able to think about the different identities that you hold, whether it's your racial identity, your gender, your sexual orientation, your socioeconomic status, your ability, right? Your citizenship, whether you were US born or you immigrated from to this country, whether or not English is your first language. There are so many different identities that we can align ourselves with that are important to us that need to be shared. And this is the time to do that self-work, because self-work ignites a more inclusive leader when we're more aware about who we are and the identities that we hold. And so I'm gonna ask you 3 questions. What identities define you? What type of leader are you? And what do you want for your community? These are 3 core questions that I would like you to think about as an emerging inclusive leader, as someone that's committed to social justice and acts of equality and equity. I want you to be able to think about what defines you in terms of your identities. Is it your gender? Is it your sexual orientation? Is it your race? Is it your ethnicity? You know, what are the salient identities that are important to you in your life? What type of leader are you, right? Are you one that it is already an inclusive leader? Do you think that you could be a better or more inclusive leader? Are you a democratic leader? Do you include all the voices that are part of your team? That is very important. And then what do you want for your community? What do you want for the people that you're serving? What do you want for the broader fraternity and sorority communities and organizations? How do you want to see that vision played out? And how can you help lead that vision as an inclusive leader? These are the type of things that I want you to be able to think about as we're moving forward in our understanding of inclusive leadership. Before we can really think about our identities in a way that informs our approach to leadership, it's important to really explain to you how diversity, equity, and inclusion are defined. To have that better understanding of these three terms is going to help you inform your role as an inclusive leader, in my opinion. And so when you think about diversity, diversity is really the unique characteristics, right, that make up an individual or a group of people. We all have very unique and different characteristics and identities that make us who we are. So there's a lot of diversity that comes into the space beyond the initial social identities that I spoke about earlier, right? And so there's the diversity in terms of, your fraternity group organization, in terms of, where people are from, what neighborhoods people grew up in, what kind of homes people grew up in. What's the educational level, right? In terms of who has received college degrees and more advanced degrees. What's individuals' class and socioeconomic status? What are people's food interests, interest in sports or music, right? And so you can really think about diversity at a broad level that encompasses a variety of different categories, right? Or you can think about diversity on a more specific and lived experience level, right? When you think about race and gender, sexual orientation, and so on. And so we want to make sure that we are creating both visible and invisible forms of diversity that can create a representation of our organization. That is very important, and that diversity is sustained over time. Inclusion, however, is this sense of belonging, right? It's this full acceptance of who you are, regardless of the identities that you hold, and the community that you're a part of creates this inclusive environment, right? Where the diversity that I just spoke about feels included, right? All forms of a diversity. So if for people of color, for women, for LGBTQ folks, are these individuals feeling included, right, in your organization, in the spaces that you have influence in? And so it's one thing to have a diverse body of people, but it's a very much an important piece to make sure that that diverse body of people feels included. Because if you don't have that sense of inclusion within your framework, then the diverse communities that you might have created will not be sustained. And then taking it a step further, equity. Equity is about thinking about how those folks within that inclusive environment have equitable access to all opportunities and resources. So there could be resources available to folks, and it could be equally distributed. But if everyone doesn't have the access to those resources, right? If there are barriers, systemic barriers that are put in place that are not giving everyone the same access to those resources, then we need to be able to readjust our approach to how those resources and how those opportunities are delivered. And so we want to make sure that everyone has full access to those resources to make it equitable. And justice, when you think about social justice, justice is really about how do we then take that equity in a way that we're able to distribute those resources and make it possible for everyone to reach their full potential and remain safe and be able to do so in a way that maintains this sense of security and comfort to be able to be yourself in a socially just world. And so if you embody these four concepts of diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice, you'll really think about inclusive leadership with a more critical lens, and it will allow you to really think about the work you need to do moving forward. And of course, there are differences that make a difference, right? I mean, all the different identities that are out there are vast. And I named a few, but I wanted to make sure I showcase some others, right, that I might not have named as well. And so when you think about the different identities and the diversity within your fraternity and other spaces that you occupy, really consider a wide variety of identities, so that your diversity is vast and represents a wide variety of folks from different backgrounds and experiences. But once again, once you have that diversity, making sure that inclusive leadership is part of that framework is so critical to ensuring effective inclusive environments are sustained. So this is the next important piece that I want to be able to talk about with you. It's this idea of being an ally, right? The word ally is not something that is still. It's an active responsibility. It's a social responsibility to speak up and speak out against all forms of injustice that you may not identify with. And it's not about identifying that singular injustice that you might be passionate about, but it's about engaging yourself in all forms of injustice, and doing so in a way that allows environments to change and move towards more equitable and inclusive environments. Being an ally is not something you turn on and turn off like a light switch. It's not something that you only do between the hours of 9 and 5. This becomes your life's purpose, to serve, to ensure that equity is met. And being an inclusive leader goes beyond just your organization. It's about, how do you lead in your family? How do you lead at your job? How do you lead in the various community efforts that you might be a part of? How are you speaking up for folks that are not able to have access to the same things that you might have access to? And so being an ally is something that we all need to be able to embody in a very active and engaged way. Being an ally is something that I want you all to think about, right? So what are going to be some ways in which you can improve your allyship towards others? And some of the things, our strategies I want to be able to provide is how do we speak up and speak out, but most importantly, don't speak over. And the speak over part is really critical, because we want to be allies to communities that we may not be a part of. We want to be able to help and support and provide advocacy. And we want to be able to speak up and speak out, but we want to make sure we don't speak over that population, right? We don't silence folks and make them feel more marginalized, because we are now taking over their space by speaking over them, as opposed to speaking with them, in support of them, and to move toward a more equitable agenda. And so here are some strategies and some things you can think about. You can support and respect one another. You could be ready to confront the confrontation as an ally, right? To confront the injustice that you see happening. You can identify the behavior more effectively. You can know that inequality isn't funny, and if you see people laughing about it or making light about it, that you bring it up as an issue and you address it head on, because you're an ally to various communities. You can avoid stereotypical language. Language matters, words matter, and they have feelings and they have emotions connected to them. And so it's important to be mindful of how your words impact others. Being a bystander isn't enough. Active allyship is critical. This is what I talked about earlier. This is not something that we can just, turn on and turn off. This is something we have to be committed to, even in our personal spaces. So if you're with a family member or a friend and they say something that's derogatory or offensive to about a group of people, are you going to speak up in that moment, or are you going to laugh with them, or are you going to just brush it under the rug as if it's not a big deal? If you're really an ally, you're going to speak up on behalf of that group, even if nobody in this space is represented that identifies with that group, but you're an ally, right? And so sometimes speaking up and speaking out against certain injustices towards family and friends is the hard piece. But I challenge you to think about how you can be doing that in a more deep and meaningful way. And then stepping out of your comfort zone, right? Stepping out of your comfort zone is very critical. We have to be able to become comfortable with the uncomfortable and lean into that discomfort to be able to move the conversation forward to a more equitable environment. That's what inclusive leaders do. And that's what I'm asking you to do. Finally, knowing yourself, right? Knowing yourself is so key. It goes back to that initial prompt that I said about who are you? So building that self-awareness, doing that self-work, is going to only allow you to be able to see the lived experiences of others and be more empathetic towards those individuals in a way that could help move the conversation forward. Audre Lorde once said, "We have been raised to fear the yes in ourselves." I want you to feel as if you can say yes to being an ally. You can say yes to being an inclusive leader. It's not easy. This is not easy work. And that's why everybody doesn't do it, right? But we're asking you to step up, to be that fraternity, to be that role model, and that the beacon of hope that we all need in our society. And so I want you to release that fear. I want you to think about, as a leader, I can, we can let the fear in a way that gets in the way change the way we want to create things. And so I want you to release the fear of certain things so that you can become that inclusive leader that is fearless, that is inspired to create change, and do so in a way that you're using your courage as a form of motivation to see the change that you want to see in the world, to see the change that you want to see in your organization. And courage is going to help get you to that next phase of inclusive leadership. When you think about inclusive leaders, when you think about ethical leaders in our society, right, in your life, one of the things that all of them embody is courage, right? And so thinking about how, as a leader, you can let go of the fear that's in your way to change, to see the change that you want to see. And using courage must be at the forefront of your agenda. And so when you think about releasing fear, I want you to release the fear of the following: making a mistake. We all make mistakes, and it's okay to make a mistake. And so recognizing that you got to own your mistake and learn from your mistake, right? That's why it's the unlearning and relearning process. That's part of your journey that's so critical. Hurting a relationship, hurting relationships, if that happens, maybe the relationship wasn't meant to be. Maybe you've grown out of the relationship because you're now more focused on inclusive work, and that relationship wasn't intended to be that goal. Thinking that you'll make the situation worse. Often, situations have to be worse before they can get better. And so we have to be open to that possibility, and recognize that as an inclusive leaders, we're willing to work despite how hard the situation may get. Wondering if people will be mad at me, right? If people are mad at you, this is the time that they need to take to look inward, to think about their own ways in which they think about inclusive leadership. And so it's not about them. It's not about you. It's about them and their need to do their own self-work. And thinking that things won't change. I think that is something that, we could certainly get hung up on, right? When we see the continued racial injustice, when we see the continued sexism in the workplace, when we could see continued forms of injustice towards the LGBTQ community, particularly trans folks, you may think that things won't change. But the reality is that you can change the spaces that you occupy. You could change the spaces that you're in, and you could create influence in those spaces. Don't think about it as, oh, I can't change the world. Well, I mean, not a lot of people can change the world, but we can change the spaces that we can control. And being an inclusive leader requires you to think sometimes on a micro level, not always on a macro level, in terms of the impact that you could have on a smaller scale. The scale being maybe your fraternity, right? The chapter that you're a part of, and how you can really think about, creating change in those smaller spaces. The goal of an inclusive leader is to leave the situation better than how you found it. And so what will you do to increase inclusion and diversity and equity in a way that will allow your organization to be better in those three areas than when you found the organization and became initially connected? So the time is now to use your privilege to be a voice for others and relearn strategies to be equity-minded, inclusive leaders for a better tomorrow. I truly believe that a better tomorrow is possible. A better world is possible. We can no longer be silent in the face of injustice that is submissive to the injustice. And if we're going to be allies, if we're going to be inclusive leaders, we have to be able to speak up and address the situations head on. And so I have hope and I have encouragement from individuals like yourself, from the work that you're doing as a fraternity, that you will seek your own truth, right? You will seek your own understanding of inclusive leadership, and you will do the work that is needed to cultivate change within your fraternity and beyond, because inclusive leadership is what's going to get us to the next level of creating a more equitable and socially just society. And so I had the opportunity at a previous institution that I worked at to create an MLK oratorical contest. And this contest allowed me to be able to focus in on creating equitable spaces for my students. They used their voice. They gave speeches that spoke about their social justice vision and its connection to Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy. And it was a really powerful experience to see our students use their voice, to be in this safe space, right? Within the cultural center that I was overseeing, a safe space for people of color to come together in community and feel proud about who they are, support their friends, and exercise their voice for change. But then what I realized as the coordinator of this event is that this space that felt so safe and so brave was temporary for many of these folks. That when they left these four walls, the fear of racial violence and other forms of discrimination and oppression awaits them, because of the ways in which society has labeled them. And so I recognized that I had created a temporary safe space. And what I really wanted to be able to think about is how can we create a temporary safe space to be more permanent, right, within our society, so it's not just locked within those four walls of the cultural center. And so I encourage you to think about, how do you then release the fear that many folks have because of the societal injustices that continue to plague our communities, right? So that when folks gather in safe spaces, they're not feeling as if these are temporary spaces, but these are spaces that will transcend beyond the spaces that they're in, right? And it takes inclusive leaders like yourself to help create that systemic change in our society that's going to move us towards a more equitable environment. So I encourage you to activate your purpose to lead inclusively, right? To lead in a way that's going to bring us to the next phase of our ability to see social justice reached at its highest peak in our society. As leaders, use your greatness, use your brilliance, your voice, your inner joy and passion for social justice to bring more light into this world. Anyone can serve as a leader. Anyone can work toward being a better leader, but it takes heart, it takes compassion, it takes an understanding and awareness of social justice. It takes knowledge and skills that are socially justice grounded, and it takes a commitment to purposefully lead inclusively, to create this as a way in which you live your life, right, in all aspects. And so I encourage you to activate your purpose to lead inclusively. Now is the time, because we need leaders like yourself. So let me provide 10 intentions to lead inclusively. One is to raise your consciousness. Be more aware of who you are and your own lived experiences and the experiences of others. Understand your worldview. Look beyond your initial sphere of influence and think about how you can understand your worldview in different capacities, in different environments, and different geographical locations, to become more aware of the experiences of others. Seek and speak your truth, right? Speaking your truth is so important to the work that you're doing, and being able to help others understand your lived experiences and where you stand. Elevate the voices of those silenced, right? Bring awareness to those individuals so that their voices can be included and be part of the conversation. They could have a seat at the table. Make sure that when voices are missing, you name that and find ways to include those voices. Understand privilege and power dynamics, right? Understand the different privileges that you may have as a result of your identities that you hold, because of societal constructs and the ways in which some groups of people have more privilege than others. And use your privilege. Use your privilege to give voice and give access to those that don't have it, and recognize how that plays out in your organization, how that plays out in different parts of the community that you might belong to, and understand how you could play a role in dismantling that. Confront your own bias. We all have bias. None of us are bias free, but we can become more aware of identifying our own bias, so that we can confront it and help dismantle it, right? And so I encourage you all to think about what type of bias you may hold when it comes to thinking about different groups of people, and name that. Work through that piece to become more aware, because that's going to move you toward becoming a more inclusive leader. Practice empathy. Practicing empathy is so important, right? We want people to feel valued, feel seen, feel affirmed, and we need to be empathetic towards their experiences and how we can be supportive and be that effective ally as an inclusive leader. So thinking about how you could practice empathy is important. Be more than just an ally, right? And so you think about your role as an ally, that's important, but we also want you to be an advocate. We want you to be an accomplice that can help solve the issues and bring out solutions that make our environments more inclusive. How do you champion these efforts in a way that shows your consistency and your full commitment to ally work and advocacy? How do you advocate for groups that you're a part of, right? That you support. And so there's certainly more levels to being an ally, but it's important to have that first initial understanding of what it means to be an ally. Dismantle systems of oppression. Our country has a long-standing history with systems that are disenfranchising certain groups of people over others. And so how can you bring about change in certain systems that have historically disadvantaged people from historically marginalized backgrounds, right? Whether it's the education system, the housing system, the criminal justice system. There are various systems in which people, particularly Black and Brown people, do not get equitable access to resources and opportunities simply because of their identity. And so we can work towards dismantling those systems to make our systems more equitable and just. And lastly, affirm others. It's so important that you take your role as a leader to be able to affirm others in their identity, help them understand who they are and how they can be of value to the community that they are part of. People want to feel seen, people want to feel heard. And as an inclusive leader, you must be aware of how you can create that opportunity for people to be heard and be affirmed in the spaces that you can have influence in. So I encourage you to think about inclusive leadership and some of the tools and resources and strategies and insights I shared today, and think about what you might stop doing, right? That might be negatively impacting your way to be an inclusive leader. Think about what you might start doing, right? Based on some of the learnings you acquired today. Think about what you might continue doing, right? So you've been doing something well, but today's learning allowed you to be inspired to continue doing it and maybe improving in certain ways. So that should be your commitments to yourself, right? As you move forward, because the learning that you acquired in this session is important, but the work that you do after the session is more important, right? Being an ally, being an inclusive leader, demonstrating those skills based on what you heard today is what's going to be important as we move this conversation forward. And so the journey continues, my friends. I want you to reimagine community as an inclusive leader and think about what that looks like for you and your organization. One, I want you to understand that communities are built through trust, relationships, and that overall commitment of one another. So making sure that you are taking time to build relationships of trust and commitment within the communities that you occupy. Understand that we're all doing the best we can most of the time, right? And so let's not put a lot of pressure on each other. Let's encourage one another to be the inclusive leaders that we're destined to be by doing the best we can. We don't know all there is to know. And as leaders, we're always learning and growing. And that's why this is a journey. And so I encourage you all to continue to educate yourself, expose yourself, enlighten yourself in ways in which you can learn more every day. Just because you are doesn't mean you understand, right? And so we want to make sure that we don't make any assumptions about people based on their lived experience, but we create space to us to understand their lived experiences in a deeper and more meaningful way. Oppression is pervasive and impacts us all. Very important. And so we need to find ways to be supportive of folks that experience oppression on a daily basis, particularly when that oppression is intersectional, and find ways to support them in their capacity. Understand that it's not our faults, but we must accept responsibility, right? There's a long history of racial injustice. There's a long history of gender injustice and other forms of inequities that we may not have been a part of during its origins, but we must accept responsibility if we hold the privilege to help dismantle the issues at hand. Recognizing that conflict and discomfort are often part of growth and being open to those conversations is so important. Seek first, understand, then be understood is critical. Practice some forgiveness and letting go. Self-work, healing, and self-love are necessary for the acceptance of others. Acknowledge, appreciate, and celebrate progress. So important. There are no quick fixes to this work. This is why it's a journey. Individuals and communities do grow and change. So I want you to be inspired by that you could be part of the change as an inclusive leader. There is hope, my friends, right? So remain hopeful, remain optimistic, and that you can do your part to create the change that you want to see in this world. And we are better together, connected soul to soul. So regardless of our identities, regardless of what our lived experiences, regardless of our thoughts and perspectives, it is more important that we stay connected soul to soul, because that's how we are better together, right? And we're all in this together as we work toward creating more inclusive environments and being supportive for the communities that we serve. And so I encourage you all to adapt some of the thinkings and insights that I shared today around inclusive leadership to enhance your organization, to enhance your communities, and to be an overall better inclusive leader for the communities and the people that you serve. I wish you all the best, and I hope that you found this session insightful, worthwhile, and some key takeaways that you'll be able to move forward as an inclusive leader for your fraternity and organizations beyond. Thank you.
We will now transition to a live Q&A with Dr. Jones.